Hello and welcome back to this damn full idealistic crusade. This video is my review of Mask of the Phantasm in the new Warner Studio label standard UHD release, which came as quite a surprise to, I think, all of us fans of Batman the Animated Series and Mask of the Phantasm in particular, since Warner has never shown that much interest in the DCAU titles outside of finally starting to release some of the series on Blu-ray after the runaway success of Warner Archive doing both Phantasm and Sub-Zero as standalone Blu-ray releases in their usual excellent style, and then the Warner Studio label comes along and does absolutely craptastic releases, including what I think is the appalling release of the animated series on Blu-ray with horrible treatment across the board. So if you've seen my extensive review of that set, you'll realize that I was very trepidatious coming to this sudden Phantasm UHD release. However, I can say this is thankfully not the nightmare treatment given to the series on Blu-ray, which honestly I feel like I need to do a follow-up review on that now that I've seen what it looks like on an OLED television upscaled to 4K, and the studio label has never addressed any of the problems, concerns, or technical defaults of that release, which really needs a recall program because it's absolutely horrible and even has multiple episodes with defective audio that they did correct for streaming because, as is typical of the Warner Studio label, they don't care about the disc releases or the people who purchase them, and they don't care about making a quality archival presentation and transfer. That again makes this Phantasm release all the more surprising because this is very much in line with what we've been seeing with their UHD releases. It still cuts corners across the board, it still has crappy encoding, it's still HDR10 only. However, the work on the front end for making this master is relatively solid, and it is a visual improvement over what we saw on the already excellent Warner Archive Blu-ray. However, that was not a 4K scanner workflow, but they did do their due diligence and did the absolute best they could with their limited time and budget, which the Warner Archive always does, and did a wonderful encoding job. So what you're seeing here on the UHD release is a brand new 4K scan from original elements, a full 4K workflow and 4K presentation with HDR10 grading, and all this is going to advance over the older Warner Archive master, which was SDR only. So on the technical side, yes, this is an improvement. Yes, you are going to see definite improvements in fine detail and color depth and all the fun stuff that comes from a new scan. They've also gone in and done a new audio remix in 5.1, but thankfully they have retained the original 2.0 track in terms of the Matrix surround track that is reflective of the original audio, and it seems to be the same track that was on the Warner Archive disc. So basically that track has been ported over, but has been made secondary to a new 5.1 remix. So to get further into the technical details, I do think the new transfer is good, and I think it hasn't gone in and gone for the crazy DNR and terrible presentation as we saw on the animated series. And that's important to note because Phantasm was done as an offshoot of the animated series. It was basically done in between the first two seasons or so, and it was designed for direct-to-video and only got the green light for being a theatrical release late in the game, which also meant that they had to very hastily reformat the film for 1.8.5 matted widescreen because that's what standard US theaters were designed for in terms of 35mm film exhibition. And of course, the original intended ratio was 1:3:3 because it was intended for VHS and Laserdisc and television broadcasts. So you do need to look at the different ratio presentations. One big mark against this release is where the Warner Archive release did retain a matted 1:7:8:1 and a 1:3:3 presentation with a disclaimer explaining why there were two ratios and why it was important. Here on this release, while it does finally give us the 1.8.5 framing, which is not something you see on really a lot of past releases. The Laserdisc was a certain ratio, and then the DVDs were a certain ratio, and then the Blu-ray was a certain ratio, and mostly they're sticking around to around 1.78 in terms of 16:9 televisions. But here we at least get the actual 1.8.5 for those who pay attention to ratios. But we lose the 1:3:3 framing, and that's a major strike against this release because that should have been retained. A lot of people prefer that ratio. It was the original ratio this was designed designed for. And of course, you have to keep in mind this was still being done, at least with some of the same constraints and the standards they had set for the standard episodes. Yes, it had a bit more time. Yes, it had more budget, obviously. And this got expanded further when it got earmarked for theatrical release sometime during the production. But it wasn't a animated feature schedule and budget in terms of being able to spend a lot of time and really get the absolute best of the absolute top tier studios. This was not a Disney production in 1993. This was still an offshoot of the animated series. So you have to expect it should have similarities with the episodes, just it's obviously a lot more polished and more time and money was put into it, and it got a theatrical sound mix and also prints made. So it looks a bit fancier, but it's still tied to the series episodes. So this is once again an absolute sign, or a big red flag waving at just how bad the actual series episodes have been treated on Blu-ray in terms of terrible compression bit rates, awful DNR, a new color timing that is frequently garish, and all the issues there are really underlined now that Phantasm not only has a better Blu-ray, but now has been revisited in the 4K ROM. So this is a big step forward over the Warner Archive disc simply on the technical side of things. However, I don't know if it was as carefully monitored in terms of the transfer process as what was on the Warner Archive disc. On that master, they had to be really careful to not have any sort of automated cleanup go in and remove any of the original animation defects and elements, which is something the whole DCAU crew is always worried about, which is why they always said they didn't want to revisit the shows in the HD realm. But unfortunately, that's what happened to Batman the Animated Series, because the idiots in charge at the Warner Studio label decided to just, as usual, have no quality control. But I don't think that, while there's no issues with this transfer in terms of seemingly removing anything, it just doesn't seem like it was done as carefully in terms of any of the cleanup processes. And that may be just me reading into it because we don't have a lot of information, but we do have some information about the Warner Archives process and the scan and transfer they did a number of years ago for the Blu-ray release. So it just, this doesn't seem to have the same quality standard. And then you look at the HDR grading, and thankfully, this does also add on the technical sides. It is an improvement over the SDR Blu-ray, but there are a few little pop-out moments that are unfortunate. As with most HDR grades on catalog titles, you have to be very careful in the grading, and if you're not as careful, you will have the dreaded sort of pop-out elements where you have certain parts of the image jump out more in terms of brightness, and it's very distracting and is obviously not part of the original material. Here, that's only really confined to light sources and anything that's white. So it's particular elements in certain scenes, especially darker scenes, and this film really lives in darkness and the shadows, growing out of Batman the Animated Series and the iconic dark deco stylings. So while most of the film looks excellent, it was unfortunate to see that there were a few pop-out moments in the HDR10 grading. It's mostly confined to some flashlights, some searchlights. So for example, in the second stalking of a mobster in the graveyard, he's got a flashlight, and so do his goons, and those to pop out a little bit. You also see some of the police searchlights, particularly around the construction site scene where you've got all the police airships going around and the SWAT vans and things. Those pop out a little bit. Basically, any kind of light sources. You also see this in the flashback sequence to Bruce's first night out, when we have the truck he's clinging onto that goes into the tunnel with the lights overhead, so that has some pop-out effects in the lights and the headlights on the truck. You also unfortunately see this in the iconic white eyes of Batman. It doesn't happen in every scene, but it does happen a number of times, particularly in Batman's first appearances and in the parking garage when he's sort of viewing the aftermath of the first attack of the Phantasm. So you will notice that the iconic white Batman eyes of the cowl do have a little bit of pop-out effect. And that's the most jarring one in terms of it sort of taking you out a little bit, because it's so rare for us to have the actual comic accurate Batman eyes in, well, we don't really get it in live action, but so in animation, that's one thing you can always do that you can't really do in live action. And so that's the most unfortunate HDR pop-out from a creative standpoint. But again, none of these are major. They're not blindingly bright, as if it were a light cannon transfer, as it's come to be known. But it was unfortunate to see that on my OLED television, there were at least a few little moments of that sort of HDR pop-out effect. But outside of those, this is, again, on the technical side, a big step forward over the Warner Archive Master. The jump to 4K also magnifies a lot of the original production shortcomings. So you will notice there are some shots that look a bit softer. There are some transitional moments that show a little bit of wear or things they had to cover up, or obviously it makes original animation errors stick out more than it did on 1080p and the Warner Archive Master. And again, this goes back to the fact that this was still linked to the animated series in terms of its production style and schedule. Yes, it's more polished, but it still has some of the inherent shortcomings, and these are just more obvious in the 4K realm. So there are a couple of moments where it gets a little softer, or the grain looks a little bit different, or you see they hold on some shots or use some still frames here and there. That's just part of the original production, and it's more obvious and visible here on the UHD release. Then you come to where we once again hit typical Warner corner cutting and not caring about quality, because while this is a UHD release and it is technically better than the Warner Archive disc, where I again point to the fact that this was not done as carefully and as with much attention paid as the Warner Archive disc. The Warner Archive disc is a maxed out bitrate for a Blu-ray. It's hitting around 35 megabits per second as a standard for the whole feature transfer, and this is not a long film either, so you can very easily do that. And since Warner has never made a special edition, and this release in particular doesn't have any real extras outside of the one lone new featurette, there's no reason for them not to do a really good transfer with a maxed out bitrate on a UHD, because the film is only around 78 minutes. Well, they have not done that. The bitrate on this UHD is usually hovering around 50 megabits per second or under, which is it's okay since the film is so short, but again, there's no reason to not max this out. And previous video releases of Mask of the Phantasm have tried to give the best quality for that time period. In particular, the Warner Archive Blu-ray has a maxed out bitrate, and even the old Laserdisc is a CAV transfer, so that means it's got more sides, but it is better encoded for the format standards of the time, and is a real animation fans style release, because you can go through it frame by frame and study each individual frame due to the better quality of the CAV format and storing frames individually. It also has better sound, but I'll get to that in a minute. So this thankfully does not have a whole ton of compression artifacts like a number of other Warner UHDs, but there are some particular moments where the bitrate drops down substantially to the 20s or even under that, and so that's really disconcerting because there's no reason for that. It's just slipshod. We don't care about presentation quality encoding, which is typical of Warner UHDs. It's never as bad as the worst parts of, say, their Enter the Dragon UHD, which has terrible compression artifacts at times. But there was at least one moment where I did notice some real funkiness, and that is in the opening title sequence, which is obviously going to look the most dodgy because that was early CG animation, and that was them kind of getting to play with the technology and show off, but obviously they could only do that short section in terms of just how much it cost that at the time to even do any CG animation. So it's obviously, at the time it was done, it looked really fancy, but now it's the most dated part of the film and is the ropiest looking and has always looked so on home video. You're always going to notice the difference, and it's nowhere near the beautiful quality of the actual hand animated feature. But now here on this release, it does look better because we have this 4K scan going back to original elements, but the encoding really pops up here because it's quite low for the opening titles, and this is where you run into some compression artifacts, and this is the one spot of the transfer where I think the encoding really rears its ugly head. So don't be thrown when you start this for the first time thinking that the whole transfer is going to look this poor. It does pick up, but it's, for the encoding to be at its worst right at the opening, it kind of sucks, which is something we saw in the Enter the Dragon UHD. But also, since this is the early CG animation that looks the ropiest now in 2023 in terms of looking at the whole feature, it doesn't help that this is the worst encoded part. So you will notice some compression artifacts in the opening sequence, the title sequence, which dovetails with it being the ropiest looking part. So that's where the compression issues really pop up, is right at the start. And so thankfully that clears up pretty quickly, but this UHD never looks as good as it could because, again, there's a massive amount of space not being used, and they didn't make a ton of new extras. They only made one. And so what are you doing? There's no reason to not just go ahead and use more space because you've made this new 4K master. You put in the money to do this, and you're trying to sell this to all the DCAU fans who all of us have bought this. So if you're not going to do anything else and you went to the trouble of making a new 4K master with HDR grading and a new audio mix, why not max the bitrate out? The film is under 80 minutes, So again, this is just an encoding job, another one from the Warner Studio label that shows they don't care about the potential of the UHD format, they don't utilize the potential of the UHD format, and all of their UHD releases to date have been compromised by having slipshot encoding jobs that really limit the effectiveness of the transfers. Thankfully, because Phantasm is shorter, it doesn't come into play as much, but when you think about it, if your UHD is around 50 megabits per second, that's not much more than the maxed out bitrate on the Warner Archive disc at 35 megabits per second. So keep in mind this UHD should be hitting 80 to 100 megabits per second on average. And the film is so short that why not? What are you doing? So again, this UHD is nowhere near as well encoded as the old Warner Archive Blu-ray, and again shows that the Warner Studio label does not care to the same degree that the Warner Archive does, and that's, pretty much part and parcel with every Warner release. That's nothing new. But here it really underlines that this release was just cranked out because they knew they could make money off of it, because they knew there was a fan base. And at least we got a revisit for Phantasm, but they need to revisit the complete series with a 4K treatment like this, which would at least improve on the horrible Blu-ray release of the complete series. So this really makes you hope that Warner at least follows suit and does a 4K revisit of the series. It's not likely, but if this sells strongly enough, which it obviously has already, if we could at least get this same sort of half-assed, we kind of sort of don't care, but at least we're now doing it more hands-off in terms of the transfer approach that we're seeing here on these Warner catalog UHDs. If that could be applied to the animated series itself, we would at least have a much better release than the piece of junk we have. Now we turn to the audio. As I alluded to before, the primary mix is a brand new 5.1 remix in DTS HDMA lossless quality. This is from the original source stems. It seems like they went back to it. It does not change any of the effects, but it is a more modernized approach to the sound design, which was originally done in Dolby SR Matrix, and that's what we have on all the past releases. This new track is an expansion of the original sound design. It obviously is bringing it into 5.1 discrete, and it does unfortunately go for a lot more modern trends in terms of mixing. It has reduced the dynamics of the track, so the track is louder, and it's louder to the point of almost clipping at times. So it is significantly louder. It doesn't ever go into clipping or brickwalling territory, but it is a significant reduction in dynamics, and it's also trying to throw more into the low end because now it has a dedicated LFE track for your subwoofer. So you will notice if you A/B between the two audio tracks on this disc that the new 5.1 is louder, it's more in your face, it's less nuanced, and it also has far less dynamics. So honestly, I would say don't bother with this track. It's going to appeal much more to modern sensibilities in terms of mixing and home theater, but it's a significant downgrade in the audio presentation, even though it doesn't change anything. So thankfully, as we saw on Enter the Dragon and some other Warner UHDs, we have an original option. Thank God. Warner has finally seen the light of actually having original audio for a film, because, it's kind of important to have the original audio mix of a film, unlike what certain studios and labels seem to think about audio remixes. So we have a secondary track, which is a 2.0 matrix stereo track in lossless DTS HDMA. And this is the original audio, and it seems to be identical, or relatively identical, to the same track on the Warner Archive release, which itself was a new transfer of the original source elements. So this is a far better listen. If you matrix it out, it still sounds excellent. This was a really well mixed film for the time. It had a lot more time and money spent in terms of the actual mixing of the audio, because it was for a theatrical release. So they spent significantly longer mixing this than they would for a television episode. So there was no reason to remix this track. It's an excellent track. Thankfully, the remix doesn't change anything, but it's just nowhere near as well mixed, because it goes for a lot more modern trends. And this original track is much more dynamic, it's much more consistent, it's easier on the ears, and if you're watching this new disc, as I was, and you're listening to the 5.1 track, you will find yourself consistently wanting to switch back to the 2.0, because it's so much more dynamic, it's easier on the ears, it's more detailed, it's more textured, and it's not as grating, because again, that 5.1 remix does get loud to the point of near clipping, and you can really see this if you capture the audio and you bring it into Audacity and you're looking at the waveform, because there are points at which you will actually see the level of the audio on the remix does get to near clipping. So thankfully there is an original option here. It does pretty much carry over the track from the Warner Archive disc, so at least we've got that. However, I still have a quirk about the audio, because this is neither of these is the best option we have. The best audio of Phantasm is still on the Laserdisc release, which has a PCM 2.0 matrix stereo track, but it seems like they took it straight from the theatrical print master back in the day, which is frequently what they would do for Laserdisc releases. So while it's the same actual original mix that's on the VHS tape release, the DVD releases in lossy Dolby Digital, and the Warner Archive Blu-ray, and now this 2.0 track on this release, if you compare this track on the Laserdisc to the Warner Archive audio, you'll note that the Laserdisc track has a fuller sound to it. It has a more cavernous, warm feel to the low end, but it's not overbearing like what you hear on the new remix that also reduces the dynamics. I do really prefer the Laserdisc audio track. I think it is substantially better in terms of maintaining the thematics and the overall feeling of the film, but it's just a difference of, I think, transferring from the print master back in the day when the film was brand new, and then Warner Archive going back to the actual source materials, because when you compare the two, the Warner Archive track, it sounds a little bit cleaner, but you also get a little more sibilance on the dialogue. It doesn't, and it also doesn't have that sort of cavernous, warm feeling to the low end. So the Laserdisc has that wonderful warmth. It also doesn't have the same harshness on the dialogue. And I think of all the presentations of Phantasm, it still is the best audio source. And I think if you have the ability to look at the Laserdisc release, you'll probably similarly impressed by the audio presentation. Of course, you do need to sit down and do direct comparisons to really note the differences between the Laserdisc audio, the Warner Archive audio, and now this new 5.1 remix, but they are very apparent when you do so. And I still think and swear by the Laserdisc audio, which is superior to even the Warner Archive track, which seems more like a flat transfer of what with the source elements in the vault, without the same sort of EQ and balancing as what was on the original release prints of Phantasm. And that seems to be replicated on the Laserdisc. So that is why I still go with the Laserdisc in terms of having the best overall audio presentation for this film. And if you're a fan of this film, you really do need the Laserdisc for the audio alone, but also the really lovely presentation of the film and a matted widescreen transfer that holds up really well for standard def in terms of Laserdisc, and of course it's CAV as well, so it's really the best the film could be on home video at the time, and is a really nice transfer of a print element and has a slightly more saturated color palette as well. But it's really the audio of the Laserdisc that is the supreme audio presentation of this film, and I know I'm not alone on this because thanks to the wonderful channel Serum Lake, who is a real Batman the Animated Series resource, they've done some interviews and even a commentary track with Kevin Altieri and others, and Kevin Altieri has expressed his love of the Laserdisc. He still has his copy and loves to crank it up, and I'm just sitting there going, yes, finally somebody else knows what I'm talking about. And of course, you know, one of the key directors of Batman the Animated Series and Phantasm would know, if anybody knows, what is the best audio presentation of the film. So again, the Laserdisc is still the best and I think definitive audio presentation of the film, but at least we have the same lovely Warner Archive track here on this UHD release. Unfortunately, it has been made the secondary track, so you will have to switch to it on the menu, and unfortunately most people are not going to do that, so they're just going to stick with the new 5.1 remix, and most people don't have surround setups, so it's going to be the new remix that's loud, less dynamic, more in your face, but crammed down probably to just plain stereo. And that's doubly ironic because Dolby Surround was designed for collapsing to stereo, and if you have the original mix engaged and you're listening in stereo, it's a better listen anyway, so it's kind of sad that that's how the film's going to be stuck now, and I'm sure that's what's on all the new streaming versions of this 4K master is this new stupid remix that was unnecessary and will sound even worse collapsed down to stereo, and the original mix sounds phenomenal in stereo because it was designed around those parameters to begin with. So then to move on to the actual disc presentation and extras, we have a very standard generic Warner menu, which is typical of Warner Studio releases, so it's nothing to write home about. We do have the new artwork for the film, which at least is one of the nicest Warner covers for a studio release in a long time. I would have preferred keeping the original theatrical artwork, but at least we got new artwork that does look quite nice and fits the film and looks good and does sort of signify this as a new release. So at least we have that, and it is far better than what we usually see and more in line with the more modern DCIU straight to video releases. We have the Warner Brothers slipcover, which they're going for in a lot of these, which then usually they stop making the slipcovers, or it's hard to get a slipcover that is not really dinged up, and it's got the sort of reflective quality on all of their slipcovers, or at least most of them. This one's a bit more reflective than most. Again, we have the new artwork, and at least it looks nicer and does give a slightly nice feel to it, but I did have to go through a number of these until I got a slipcover that wasn't super dinged up, but as you can see, even this has wear, so it's kind of, no matter what you do, you're going to get one that has wear and tears on it. There's also a steelbook version of this made available as a store exclusive. I'm just not really a fan of steelbooks, but at least that is an option with the new artwork. And then there were some sort of more limited touted versions, and primarily the steelbook, that did include a miniaturized version of the original comic adaptation. So at least that is bundled in as a nice option, but it's also significantly more expensive. And Warner did this back in the day with the VHS release. I do have the slimmed down version for the VHS clamshell of the comic, and that was nicely done. So, you know, honestly, if you're going to do a big limited package or a more limited package in terms of how you were selling it, the comic is a nice idea, but you should have made an actual special edition with extras if you were going to do that. So it's another example of Warner making these half-assed, overpriced, limited edition steelbooks with just a little bit of swag that doesn't really justify the price increase, and it's not a real special edition either. So you take the slipcover off, and we have the same art for the standard case, and once they stop making slipcovers, this will be what you find. The artwork is the same on the back as well. And then we have a plain black generic label for the UHD. There is no Blu-ray included, so obviously this is just UHD and digital copy only. And as is typical of Warner Studio releases, most infuriatingly, the disc release is HDR10 only, but the compressed streaming version does have Dolby Vision. So go figure there. I don't really stream anything, but from what I've heard from others, the Dolby Vision on Warner streaming titles doesn't really make a whole lot of difference compared to the HDR10 on the disc versions, but that's just a backwards way of thinking from Warner. If anything, the disc version should have the Dolby Vision grading, which is supposed to be more nuanced than HDR10, and the streaming version should have HDR10. This is just backwards, or they should both have Dolby Vision, If you're going to have one with Dolby Vision, that doesn't make sense to not have the other. It's just you're cheaping out on paying licensing fees a little bit. But if one version should have Dolby Vision, it should be the more premium disc option, which is technically better than the compressed streaming version, but there's nothing with the Warner Studio label that isn't somehow backwards in its thinking and approach, and especially the fact that they have no quality control, that just goes hand in hand with that. So do keep in mind the streaming versions have Dolby Vision for new Warner masters, and the discs are still HDR10 only because Warner's gonna Warner. Now, in terms of the supplement, once again, this is not a special edition. This does not have the number of extras that all fans have always hoped for, and it doesn't even carry over the one real extra from previous releases, which was the original trailer. So this doesn't have the trailer for the film, and that's kind of bizarre. That was the one thing we had, and Warner Archive actually went and made a new HD scan of the trailer. So that was the one extra that release had, in addition to the 133 presentation. So that means on this release you lose the alternative and honestly the original intended ratio, which is a major thing, and you lose the original trailer. So since they didn't use a massive amount of space on this disc, there's no reason they couldn't have the other ratio of the film and the trailer on here as well. But, Warner's gonna Warner. We do have one new extra, surprisingly, and that is the featurette on Kevin Conroy, which is thankfully well done and quite lengthy, and also obviously a tribute piece since he recently passed away, and it really gutted all of us. And this is reflected in the new piece, which is pretty much interviews with the main BTAS cast and crew, and they're just as emotional as all of us fans still are, and that really makes this very heartwarming. And they also use a few clips and pieces of Kevin Conroy talking, and particularly some of the interviews that were done for the old DVD sets. It's very well done, and it's very touching to hear directly from the main cast and crew. I mean, Paul Dini starts almost tearing up in spots, and it's just like it's at least nice to know that obviously they're just as emotional about it as we all are as fans of the show, and what it's meant to us for all of these years, that and for Kevin Conroy seeming like such a wonderful and incredibly genuine person that he really was, and that they're still choked up about it. So it's very well done, very heartfelt. And interestingly, for me being a giant nerd, when they cut to Bruce Timm, he's got I don't know if it's his bookshelf or somebody else's, but if he ever needed a sign that the BTAS crew understood Batman and the world of adventure characters and comics better than anybody else around, if you look closely at the wall of books behind Bruce Timm, you can do probably the ultimate bookshelf peeping, in terms of it being probably the best shelfie ever, because it's a wall of primarily pulp stories. You can see classic Shadow reprint in terms of the paperbacks with the Steranko covers, Doc Savage reprints, Avenger reprints, and then the iconic Signet 60s James Bond paperbacks. So I literally had to pause every time Bruce Timm popped up, because I'm sitting there squinting and going, oh my God, look at this. Oh my God, look at this. Oh my God, there's more pulps over here. So pay attention and notice that. I've even made Twitter posts about it because I'm so obsessed with that shelf. It's like a dream shelf. I do have a number of those in other editions and things, but that was just amazing. So again, if you ever needed more concrete evidence that the BTAS crew understands storytelling better than anybody else, there you go. So that was really wonderful to see. But unfortunately, this is the only extra on this disc, and again, we even lose the trailer, and there's so much tied to this film, and fans have clamored for a special edition for years. The creators themselves have bemoaned the fact that they haven't been able to do one. Paul Dini recorded a commentary with Kevin Smith, and now, again, going back to the Serum Lake channel to sort of combat this issue, he went and actually got original crew to come and do a new commentary track for the film. But it's a video commentary, so you can actually see them reacting to the film in picture-in-picture. So I strongly recommend you go and look at the Serum Lake channel and that video commentary. I'll leave a link in the description below. So that is now 2 commentaries made outside of Warner by original crew, because Warner doesn't care about making extras. But we did get this one new featurette, at least, that is lengthier. It is over 20 minutes. So at least it's not, perfunctory. But we, once again, oddly, don't have that vintage HBO first look piece with actual footage of Mark Hamill and Kevin Conroy in the recording booths and talking about the film. So you have to look at that on YouTube, which I'll also link to as well. But I strongly recommend looking at the new video commentary that, again, I'll have in the description. And if that's still not enough Phantasm content for you, of course, I myself did a commentary track for this film because it is a masterpiece and the best Batman film ever made, and it deserves all the commentaries. So if you want to hear my own nerdy ramblings on the film and Batman as a character in general and Batman the Animated Series, if my various B-test videos and videos on Phantasm and video releases have not been enough of my B-test rambles, I have done my own commentary. So there are 3 commentaries at least, in addition to all the other fan commentaries out there. So again, this is a release that fans and the crew themselves have had to go and make extras for. So again, this is a missed opportunity, and this could have been a really great special edition and should have had both ratios, but at least we got a halfway decent presentation that is not the monstrosity of the series on the Blu-ray release. So that's the real surprise here, that Warner cranked out another UHD that is halfway decent, but just falls short in every other area. But thankfully, it does have an original audio option. So to summarize all of that, overall, this is a must-purchase UHD. It is a big technical upgrade over the Warner Archive disc. However, it was not done to their quality standard, but that goes without saying because the Warner Studio label doesn't care about these things. The disc is HDR10 only. It does have a inferior encoding, which does pop up in the opening titles, but thankfully, because the film is short, it doesn't really cause major issues elsewhere. The HDR grading is good on the whole, but it does have some pop-out moments and is unfortunately HDR10 only and should have been Dolby Vision, along with actually being a maxed out encoding to actually use up more of the disk space that is left unused. We do lose the all-important 1:3:3 original ratio presentation, which the Warner Archive disc does have, so do hang on to that disc. This should have been on here, and they had the space to do it, or they could have made this a 2-disc affair and made it a real special edition and actually gone to the trouble of making new extras and finally including that vintage HBO first look piece, in addition to also keeping at least the trailer, which also got dropped. We do have the new audio remix, but that is really, I would not recommend using that. It's more in your face, it's louder to the point of almost clipping, it's far less dynamic, and it tries to throw a lot more into the low end. So it is an inferior presentation compared to the 2.0 original mix option, which is ported from the Warner Archive disc, but I still think the Laserdisc is the best audio option. So if you want the best audio presentation of the film, you do have to track down the Laserdisc and get a working Laserdisc player to have, I think, the best audio presentation of the film by a great margin. But at least we have the same track as the Warner Archive disc, and it's a great listen. It's just not quite as good as the Laserdisc track. The new artwork is nice. At least this is at an affordable price point and will frequently go on sale just like other Warner 4K catalog titles. So if you wait a little bit, you can maybe catch it on sale, and there is a steelbook option should you wish to go that route. The new extra piece on Kevin Conroy is nicely done and very genuine and heartfelt, and the interview reviews are fantastic, but there really should have been more extras, and the weirdness of even dropping the trailer was bizarre, but this doesn't have a lot of effort put into it. Ultimately, we at least got a good new scan that is a technical upgrade, and we got this new extra, and we have the same track as the Warner Archive disc for the original audio option. But in all other areas, this is just another Warner disc that has been cranked out with no real effort, and the encoding is not good, and just it just reeks of being just another product cranked out with no attention or care put into it. And had the Warner Archive done this as their first UHD title, oh boy, it'd be a whole different story. We probably wouldn't have gotten the new featurette, or maybe we still might have, since these are usually done by other entities and then put on a disc. But even if we didn't get the new featurette, if Warner Archive had done this, it would have been a maxed out bit rate. It would have had both ratios. It probably would have been a 2-disc affair. With good encoding, you could get away with having both ratio presentations on a single UHD disc because the film is so short. But Warner Archive would have made sure to max out the bitrate still, and it still would have been higher than the presentation we have here of just one version. So. And Warner Archive would have probably just had the same track as before, which would have been still a great option. I think it's the second best audio presentation of the film on disc, but the Laserdisc still wins out. But it's sure as heck would have been a better presentation than this. And it would have been cheaper too, and had original artwork. So once again, the Warner Archive always outdoes the studio label, but that goes without saying. So yeah, this is a must-upgrade title. It is an improvement over the Warner Archive disc, but it doesn't have the same attention put into it. It doesn't have the 133 presentation. Yes, it's finally 185, and yes, it has the secondary audio option, but it just sucks that we can't get a real special edition still. So that's where we stand with Mask of the Phantasm. At least this is an upgrade, but there are still some drawbacks of it being a standard Warner Studio release, and once again shows that they don't really care about catalog titles, and we're lucky to get what we get. But at least this is not the abominable treatment that was given to the series on Blu-ray, and it really makes you hope that the series gets revisited. It's very unlikely, but if it did, it would at least be a halfway decent presentation like this UHD of Mask of the Phantasm. So those are my thoughts on the Phantasm UHD. I would love to hear your own thoughts if you've looked at this 4K release on your own setup in the comments below, so feel free to leave any further comments. I will link to the other commentaries and the Serum Lake channel as well in the description, so please go and check out that wonderful channel. It's really the best BTAS channel I think there is on YouTube. He does some really great work and gets a lot of great interviews and has fascinating storyboards and different elements, so it's really for the hardcore BTAS fan. I think the real surprise here is that this is a halfway decent upgrade, and Warner's studio division has been doing better with their UHDs, so this is along the lines of Enter the Dragon in terms of that UHD being the best we've ever gotten so far, but having some real issues in terms of compression and not caring about quality control that do hold it back. So that's what we have here on Mask of the Phantasm as well, unfortunately. So at least it's an upgrade, and at least it's solid, and it's not the travesty that it could have been, like the terrible complete series Blu-ray release. So as always, I hope my babblings on the world of Batman the Animated Series, Mask of the Phantasm, and physical media releases has been at least somewhat fun and informative. Please do keep supporting both studio and boutique labels by buying films on disc to help keep both physical media and film culture alive. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching. I found Mask of the Phantasm on 4K UHD at least a solid but underwhelming experience due to it being a Warner Studio release. HDR10 only, and only one new featurette. It's not much, but it's been that kind of Warner day.